can be a little challenge sometimes to narrow some things down. So hopefully you have questions. And also I'm sort of like in between things right now. The newest work that's happening are these two more kind of traditional paintings, these rectangular pieces. And that's sort of where the work is going, and it's sort of a much different kind of conceptual strand in there. And I put them in the show just to sort of kind of see how they would interact with all this other stuff mostly. So that's kind of where the work is going, and then the other work is sort of an accumulation of things that have been happening for quite a while. My studio practice is really sporadic, and I consider like really non-linear. Like things sort of jump around a lot in my studio and fluctuate really, really highly all the time. When I was in graduate school, my studio sort of became like our department's recycling center. People would just leave crap outside my door and assume that I would do something with it. And that sort of became like a really kind of fertile kind of thing for me to start dealing with. These sort of really unexpected, non-art-like materials started to really affect what I was doing significantly. And at that time, I had lots of time and lots of space to sort of do lots of large things. And I just learned a lot about materials in a really kind of non-traditional sense. So now I go to a hardware store and sort of see it more like I'm at art stores. And so my knowledge of materials is really diverse, and it's kind of a really open dialogue at all times. And this work, sometimes it takes a really long time to develop. The gestation period is, some of this stuff is several years, and things get reused, kind of recultivated, constantly, over and over and over again. For instance, this piece that this kind of larger site-specific piece, that is a studio rug that was never in my studio, is in someone else's studio, then someone else's studio, then I picked it up somewhere and it accumulated paint, and it's been in 2 or 3 different sort of sculptural iterations over the past 5 years, and then it kind of turned into this, sort of unexpectedly. So I kind of see some of these pieces, these small works, as almost like game pieces that sort of can function in a lot of different situations. And these pieces are a lot of times repeated from show to show, however they're always altered slightly, because I might put something up. For instance, I just had another show just a few months ago of a lot of this similar work, but then it came back to my studio for a few months and things got altered quite a bit, and now it's sort of represented as something else. And I see my practice kind of similar to the way, I think of like the way musicians work, because I'm a musician as well. And I think of the word play a lot, and sort of the way play changes from person to person and from generations, et cetera. I also have 2 children currently at this time, and their definition of play is also very different. So I think of the word play in terms of, we kind of consider it something that children do, but then it's also something that like a jazz saxophonist does. We say they both play, however, what they're doing is very, very different, but there's still like a lot of similarities. And sort of as we kind of mature and grow up in things, we're kind of expected to sort of forget how to do that at some point. So I'm sort of looking at materials with a lot of those kind of things in mind. And there's a lot of sort of improvisation based on what's going on in the studio, similar to the way I would sort of improvise with a group of musicians that I might be working with or whatever. So things are constantly bumping against each other, materials are constantly rubbing against each other to sort of see what happens. And I really see that process of working really as kind of the main content. I think of it as the actual results of the work that is presented are literally just sort of results. And I like to sort of present them that way. For instance, this piece behind it is a lot of small works. These things have existed in a lot of different versions. Some of them have had paint collected for 5 years or more, just sort of accumulating. And what I like about this sort of installation is it has the ability to sort of reduce a hierarchy between all these things. So all of a sudden, the thing that might look like a really traditional painting next to a thing that might be sort of literally picked out of the trash is presented in a way that sort of lacks a lot of judgment, right? There's not necessarily one thing that rises as being more important than something else. And that's a way to kind of show these things as results to a process. The way you could sort of think a scientist might do dozens of experiments, and they might all fail, but they're still going to show results for every single one because they want to see what changes from time to time, from some small variations within a process. The results kind of show that change. So I kind of see the work, this sort of small work, installation work, sort of working that way, in that the work is more about this sort of process, and what is ended up being presented is literally just sort of a record of the process. And it's been obviously hugely affected by a lot of things in my life, a lot of things subconsciously that I'm not really paying attention to at the time, that just sort of come up throughout the work. And the work is sort of constantly in dialogue with itself, as well as sort of things that are in my life, materials that are in my life, things that I'm looking at, things that I'm listening to. So there's a lot of references in the work, and sometimes it takes a really long time for those references to sort of rise to the surface. There is a lot of references to music that I listen to that I haven't figured out yet. I think that might be sort of the lifelong project of figuring out how this stuff connects to music. So I don't really have a whole lot of answers on that front, but there's something there definitely. For instance, this wall of drawings over here, these were all, I guess they're prints, they're not really drawings. They're prints. So essentially I was doing this series of paintings, and there's, I think, 20 or so small paintings that I thought would be in the show that are not in the show, which is kind of great. So what I did was, throughout the painting process, I would put down lots of different materials on these canvas surfaces or panel surfaces, and then use just kind of scrap butcher paper to put it down on the painting surface, and then peel it off and sort of remove some of the paint to kind of take away some of the kind of brushwork and sort of just alter the surface of the actual painting. And then what ended up having over several months is I had this accumulated pile of paper scraps that had these really beautiful combinations of strange materials, and then I cut them down and put them here. And what ended up happening was this work, which was really literally the leftovers, like literally just the junk that was used to create a different surface, became more important than the actual surfaces. I think this is more important to me than the actual paintings that this is from. And one of the things I really like about something like this is the formal decisions are sort of non-existent in the making, because they're literally just smash a piece of paper against a wet surface, pull it off, cut it into a square. There's absolutely no really like major formal decisions in terms of this red should go next to this blue, et cetera, et cetera. It's all just sort of happenstance, but it's based on the formal decisions in something else that you don't see as a viewer. So there's kind of this strange takeaway of some of them look like they might be really specific choices, and they are, but they're shown as a byproduct as opposed to actually showing the thing. And that has become really important and something I've been thinking about a lot in all of my work. At some point I had a critique with someone, and I was making some really terrible work at the time. And it was this artist, and I'm still friends with him, he's a great guy. He came to my studio and we were talking, and we ended up talking about all the junk that was left over from the work. The paper scraps, the spray over marks on the wall, the paint splatter on the floor. We talked about that stuff because that was more interesting in the work. And I found that still is really, really important, and that's how a lot of this work comes about. So my studio is sort of like this nest of junk that is constantly accumulating, and I sort of really kind of invert kind of my knowledge of importance between those materials that are happening. For instance, this is a Christmas tree from a couple years ago. I was standing on my front porch on like January 2nd with clippers. My wife thought I was insane. And it sat around for 2 years in my basement doing nothing. It became like this really precious thing, like, oh, it's a great form. I don't know what the hell I'm gonna do with it. I'll just let it sit for a while. And I almost threw it away until this happened, and now it's in this show, and I actually like it quite a bit. We'll see if it makes the ride home, but so things like that. You know, the materials sort of, sometimes they take a really long time to process for me, as well as the meaning behind the work as well. Kind of sometimes takes a very long time to process. Like the work I made 2 years ago, I know a lot more about that work now, even though I haven't been doing that for a while. It's taking that long to sort of catch up for me sometimes. The newest things, these two paintings I can talk briefly about, it's a really different process that's going on. They actually both started as paintings that just sort of accumulate paint over time. Oftentimes in the studio I have a canvas sitting around or a panel sitting around where I just sort of scrape extra stuff at the end of the day just because I don't want to waste paint. So these panels are both, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years old. And there's a lot of paint accumulated behind these surfaces. And then at some point, I was making and what you see just happened the past 2 months or so. So everything you see is new. Behind the painted surface, there's actually a black and white photograph, a grayscale photograph, collaged into the surface. So there's the layers of the painting, there's accumulation of paint that took a really long time, and then it's literally completely covered up with a grayscale, just cheap photograph. It's like that's like one large, whatever it is, 48 by 36 photograph or so. And the photograph, that's what I'm kind of dealing with right now. Like, what does that mean? What kind of photograph I'm going to do within this work, what that's going to change. So the photograph of that is actually this really abstract photograph of another painting that I took. And then it's extremely abstract, just sort of like blotches of black and whites. And then I sanded the surface. And what happened when I sanded the surface is the surface below that paper and that paper became completely interchangeable. I couldn't tell anymore what was the photographic surface and what were the blemishes that were left from me sanding into that surface. So all of a sudden, there's this weird tension between the image and the object. And that's something I think I've been dealing with for a long time, and it's kind of the larger dialogue, this constant sort of conversation between something that is an image that you're supposed to view, but also you literally react to as an object, which is a very different sort of exchange of ideas, the exchange of emotions existing within something. So I had this crazy surface. I couldn't tell what was photographed, what was painted. It was this sort of strange alien thing. And I'm teaching right now a painting class, intro to painting class, and a color theory class. So I've been thinking about a lot of painters that I haven't thought about in years. So all of a sudden, I just started kind of painting this thing. And I'm like, oh, I have this great black and white surface. I'll just, in color theory class, I was talking about matching values with hue. So I'm like, oh, I'll just do that. I'll see what happens. So that's literally what I did. I just painted random hues, but I matched them with the grayscale value of that photograph. And this is what happened after I filled up most of the surface. And then like, oh, that was pretty interesting. I should do it again. So I did it again here, alterated some things a little bit. I'm like, oh, I should do a monochromatic version to see what happens, right? Sort of really pare things down. And this is what happens. So that's kind of the next step that I'm working with, is this sort of new process is a little bit more linear. So we'll kind of have to figure out how to deal with that. And the choices are just very, very different, but I feel like there's a really kind of strong dialogue happening. Because now all of a sudden, for instance, the photograph that's behind the surface that you can't really see, the things I'm thinking about are, okay, if this is a photograph, if this is a portrait of me, or if it's, a portrait of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay or something, all of a sudden, there's a really, really different kind of embedded content within that work that you may or may not pick up on. You probably won't. So all of a sudden, that's like a really big issue I'm going to have to be dealing with. The image that I'm literally reacting to is going to alter these things conceptually a lot for me here soon. The nice thing about this process is it's kind of cut and dry, which is very, very unusual for what I do. What I've been doing for years is just sort of this mashup of stuff. And all of a sudden, my process is really linear with these paintings and cut and dry and kind of predictable for me, which is kind of a nice change from what I've been doing for a while. So we'll kind of see how that happens. I'll kind of see if I can fight the urge to like collect Christmas trees and collect string and things like that. But so that's where the new work is going. And it just happens, I think, to work well with this kind of other body of work that's been going on for a while. And I think that there's going to be a constant exchange between these processes of working. But for now, I'm gonna paint for a while and sort of see what happens. I feel like a post-impressionist suddenly, which is never something I ever thought would come up for me. But
any questions?
Any questions?
Do you feel like there's any sort of relationship that you can recall at this time that is making you steer towards painting? Is it maybe being a teacher?
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing, being a teacher, making sort of sculptural site-specific work for quite a while now. It's great, and I love lots of things I've been able to do, but at this point in my life, this is also kind of another larger thing. At some point, you have to make work that you can make. Like, I can't go out and, for instance, cast glass simply because my lifestyle doesn't allow me to be able to have the skills and have the shot to do that. So on one hand, you have to make work that you can make that sort of fits in your life. regardless of how much that work can sort of alter your lifestyle, that's sort of a different conversation. But so at some point, there is kind of a pragmatic thing of, right now in my life, making these paintings has been a hugely fulfilling thing. And I've kind of had this thought recently, now that I've been teaching painting this semester for the first time. All of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, just the painting itself, there's enough to deal with for hundreds and thousands of years. Like just that one thing, there's enough there to deal with for generations and generations. So focusing on that for a while is going to be really kind of exciting for me. It's also kind of a way for me to build a slightly more coherent body of work simply for myself, not for anything else, just to kind of see how something changes with small movement over time, as opposed to sort of large, gigantic leaps that I've been doing for a while. I'm kind of excited to do the same thing for a year or two or more and kind of see what happens within that kind of structure for a while.